Hello, today we're going to be doing a review / discussion on F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, an American classic. Some would say the great American novel, although I dispute that. I think it's a good novel. I don't think it's the great American novel, or the best American novel, or the best novel of the 20th century. But anyway, so basic review. It's short. It contains it's not necessarily super confusing. It's pretty straightforward plot. It's interesting. There's a little bit of mystery and intrigue. There's a lot of good commentary, and it is interesting. What's kind of interesting is some background on F. Scott Fitzgerald. He was born in 1896, and he went to let's see, I think Princeton. Yeah, Princeton at age 17, where he met and kind of fell in love with a beautiful and wealthy girl whose name was Minerva King. And she ended up kind of leaving him, or dumping him, or, not talking to him anymore because he didn't meet the social standards that she needed for her position. And so essentially that kind of stuck with him his entire life, and you can really see that in the relationship from Gatsby to Daisy. And then he famously married Zelda, and, wrote about the Jazz Age, expatriate. Anyway, his life was not super happy, necessarily. But let's see. So, The Great Gatsby is kind of like, well known for being a good example of the Jazz Age, which I think is a term Fitzgerald coined for like the 20s, kind of that like post-World War I America. He spent some time in Paris, like when they were all doing that with Hemingway and those guys. He and Hemingway were friends. If you read A Movable Feast, there's a couple funny little things about F. Scott Fitzgerald. Anyway, this is definitely his most well-known novel. I mean, he has some other novels. And I haven't read them, but I've heard they're fairly good. But this is by far his like most well known. I found this is like, I think, the second time I've had to read this. I found the language more interesting this time, and I mean, there were parts I really, really enjoyed. It's a good book. I liked it. I think I'd give it 3.5 stars. Something like that. Okay, so that's my review. 3.5 stars. It's pretty good. It's interesting. It's an American classic, so I highly suggest reading it. It's not super boring, and it's not like super difficult, so anybody could read this and get something out of it. And it is really interesting, and it is important, and it brings up a lot of important discussions. So now I'm going to be talking about some thematic elements, so if you are not wanting to have anything ruined for you, I would leave now. And if you want, or if you've read the book, or you want to hear some stuff thematically that I'm going to talk about, go ahead and stick around. Again, if you want to comment on something, do it in the comments below. Do your best not to spoil people, and, if you look in the comments and you see something that looks like a comment about plot and you don't want to be spoiled, avert your gaze. So, bye for all of you who are leaving. For all of you who are staying, one of the things that we were talking about in my class, which I thought was really interesting, is who is Nick? Is he trustworthy, or isn't he? He says he thinks he's one of the few honest people in the world, and that's a quality he appreciates in himself. But it's kind of, there's a little bit of called into question whether or not Nick is honest. Jordan Baker, towards the end, says that she thought he prided himself on being honest, implying that he's not. Although Nick does appear to have a moral center, because at the very beginning of the novel, he talks about identifying with his father's advice, which implies that he never really rebelled against his parents because he's 30 years old, and he quotes his father. Long day. Anyway, the other thing we talked about was like where does Nick, because Nick is essentially reporting on Gatsby's life and his story, and one of the things is, where does Nick get this information? What are his sources, and are they reliable? And if they're not reliable, how can you trust any of the story? And I mean, if you really look at where he gets the information about Gatsby, it's pretty unreliable. He gets part of the story from Gatsby's dad, then he gets part of the story from Gatsby himself, who contradicts himself later. He gets stories from Mayor Wolfsheim, Jordan Baker, who are both not really reputable. And then he gets stories from like newspapers, the news report, some gossip, which isn't very reliable. And then Tom Buchanan, who also isn't reliable because he doesn't like Gatsby. Although he may be the most reliable because he's looking for the truth. So essentially, this is all done on purpose to make it so Gatsby can never be seen clearly. He is ambiguous. And the professor said that's part of the reason why he thinks none of the film versions really capture the essence, because they make Gatsby so accessible. Like in the most recent version, he's like, he is a major part of the story, but they make it so he's understood, and in the book, they make it so it's almost like you never see him clearly defined. He's really ambiguous. As far as, like, is he a social construct or the ideal ego for the young James Gatz, who creates Jay Gatsby? And then, let's see, I'm just looking over some notes. You can tell I take really good notes. One of my notes just says, Tom is essentially an asshole. Which is true, but I could take better notes. One interesting thing that I never really thought about before, but my professor pointed out, and I was like, oh, I guess that makes sense. When James Gatz is laying the thing he first kind of like, the material thing that he first falls in love with that makes him kind of start this is Dan Cody's yacht. And it says it symbolizes all the beauty and wonder in the world. And then our teacher's like, well, what do you do if you're sailing a yacht? You're a captain or a sailor. And then he's like, what about Daisy? What is the thing that is referred to as the thing that, is her most desirable quality? And it's her voice. It's the way her voice sounds. And he goes, what other mythical woman whose voice draws sailors to their dooms? And then it's like, oh, it's the sirens. And then I was like, whoa. Daisy's a siren, like a literal oh my goodness. Siren. And that would make Gatsby kind of like Odysseus, like trying to go by, which I thought that was kind of interesting. Always like the Bible, Shakespeare, and Homer. Those guys are always popping up. So anyway, I'm just going to read to you probably one of the most famous quotes out of this book, but also one of my favorite. And it's literally the very end, so seriously, if you haven't read it and you don't want to be spoiled, don't listen to this. And it goes, as I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. I mean, that's a great way to close a novel, right? Anyway, I'm going to leave you with that before I say something really dumb. Hope you enjoyed it, and as always, happy reading and have a good life.